So here's the situation. My boss, as bosses are wont to do, is worried about rising costs, particularly when it comes to tech spend. He has asked me to pull a couple of reports and to tell him how much we spend on average for each asset type, how many of each asset type are distributed to employees, and what is the average device spend per employee. I went to my trusty fictional asset tracking software and I pulled out this report. It gives me the employee number, the employee name, the asset type, and the asset cost when it was purchased. There are many ways to answer these questions, but in this video, I am going to show you how to answer all of these questions very quickly using Google Sheets built-in pivot table functions. So the first step of putting together a pivot table is always to insert it. I am going to select the range of where my data exists. So that would be all of this. And then I'm going to find my little insert button and then pivot table. Once you click the pivot table button, a little pop-up window will ask you to confirm your range and whether or not you want to insert to a new or existing sheet. I don't have an existing sheet that I would like to insert to, so obviously it's going to be new. And as for the range, as you can see, because I highlighted only the columns, this range is actually open-ended, and that is just fine. If you can close the range off, so you could say A through D, 125. The problem with doing it that way is that if you wanted to add data later on, you would have to then manually adjust the range on your pivot table, which is why I always like to leave my ranges open-ended. Once you create a pivot table, it basically looks just like a blank box because Google Sheets doesn't actually know what you want to explore. Google Sheets actually is pretty smart, and they've suggested some questions for me, which is interesting because this is actually one of the questions that my boss wanted me to ask, but I'm going to actually show you how to build this from scratch just in case the suggestion isn't exactly what you want answered. Pivot tables are comprised of 4 different pieces, which are rows, columns, values, and filters. Essentially, the only mandatory pieces of this you really need to use in order to get any valuable data out of a pivot table is rows and values. Columns can be very valuable, but it depends what kind of data you're looking at. And filters are self-explanatory, which is if you just want to shrink down your data set to something very specific. So the first thing you're going to want to do is determine your rows, which is your record level. Deciding what to put in your rows should be driven by the question and usually follows what you are trying to look at for each or per. So if the question is how much do we spend on average for each asset type, your rows are your asset types. And the question is, what is the average device spend per employee? Your rows are then going to be your employee. So that is how your record level is going to be determined. In order to answer questions 1 and 2, which both ask about each asset type, I am going to drag the asset type into my rows. I can also use this little add button over here, but I'm a drag and drop kind of girl. As you can see, as soon as I have dragged in my asset type over here, I get a list of all of the possible asset types. The next mandatory part of a pivot table is the values. That is basically going to ask the question of what is it you are trying to calculate. Typically, this is some kind of number because you are going to aggregate it, meaning you are going to run some kind of calculation. You're going to sum, you're going to average, you're going to do standard deviation, whatever it is that you're going to do. So in this case, we're asking for the average cost. So I'm going to grab my asset cost and then drag it into my values. It will summarize by sum, but in this case, we actually do want the average. If I wanted both the sum and the average, I could actually drag asset cost in here twice and have both the sum and the average. Now, this answers question number 1 for my boss, but it's not very pretty. So in order to make it a little bit prettier, I am going to make use of this little filter button. I'm going to add the asset type and just make sure to remove the blanks. What that will do is make sure that I don't have a blank row at the top for my little div. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight these 2 columns and format them as currency so that they're a little bit prettier. The next question is how much of each asset type are distributed to employees? In order to answer that question, I have to essentially count how many employees have assets. Now, that's not a number on my data set, so I have to essentially count the number of rows that have unique employee names. Well, pivot tables are built to do that too. So what I'm going to do is I could grab employee name, but if you've watched any of my other videos, you know I'm into unique identifiers. So I am going to grab the employee number. Of course, Google Sheets reads that as a number. So I want to change my sum to account A, and that will tell me how many headsets, laptops, webcams, and wireless keyboards I have out in the field, how much I have spent on average for each of them, and how much I have spent total on them. Awesome. So that answers questions 1 and 2. So what is the average device spend per employee means that I have to actually change my record level because I'm no longer asking about the spend per device type. I am now asking about the spend per employee. So like I said before, this is where I would replace asset type with employee number. If I were planning on exporting this report, I will probably also add employee name. Now, as soon as you've added multiple row types to your pivot table, it's going to try and like be clever and give you little totals and stuff like that. Personally, I find this very annoying, so I always uncheck my totals. So here you have it, the average asset cost per employee, the sum of asset cost per employee, and the number of assets that each employee has deployed to them.
Thanks for watching. Drop your questions and comments down below and give us a thumbs up if you found this helpful. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and join our exclusive IT community at tabgeeks.com.